Okay, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, ich freue mich, Sie zu der Debatte unter dem Titel Europe on the Move, Erinnerung an die Migration zum 100. Jahrestag des Vertrags von Lausanne begrüßen zu dürfen.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am very happy that I can welcome you to the debate on the future of Europe, and I'm from the European Labor Unions Solidarity, and I will represent the German Institute in Warsaw. This is a great joy to us to run this debate in these beautiful surroundings in Bremerhaven. That is why I have the honor to welcome the scientific employee of this house, Mr. Christoph Bonker and Simone Blaszke. And I also like to ask you to say some welcoming words in the beginning.
Ja, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren,
ladies and gentlemen,
lieber Professor Rass, liebe Panelists, seien Sie uns nun
dear Professor
hier vor
Rass,
Ort
dear panel members, all those
unterwegs,
present here,
also
all
anderswo
those
vor Ort,
away
liebe Mitglieder des
on the
European
road,
Network Remembrance
the
Solidarity
members of the European movement of European
im Namen des
Solidarity.
Deutschen Auswandererhauses
In the
anstelle unserer
name of
Direktorin
the
Dr.
European
Simone
Migration
Blaszka
House,
freue
I'd
ich
like
mich, Sie heute
to
hier in
welcome
Bremerhaven
Mr.
oder an
Blaszke, and
Ihren
I
Rechnern
am happy
begrüßen
that
zu
I
dürfen.
can
Wir
welcome
freuen
you
uns
here
sehr, dass
in
diese Veranstaltung hier
Bremerhaven or
stattfindet
online.
und
I'm
danken
very
dem
happy
European
that
Network
this
Remembrance and Solidarity und dem Bundesinstitut für Kultur und Geschichte des östlichen
event
Europa
takes
dafür.
place, and I would also like
Dass
to
sie hier
thank for that
stattfindet,
European
scheint mir sehr passend zu
House
sein.
of the History. It
Bremerhaven ist
seems very
einerseits ein
good that this
Erinnerungsort für die
takes place
deutsche
here
und
because this is the
osteuropäische
remembrance
Auswanderung im
place
19.
of
und
the
20. Jahrhundert nach
Polish and
Übersee.
European
Mehr als
migration
7,2
in the
Millionen
20th
Menschen haben
century
von hier
abroad.
aus
More than
Europa verlassen.
7.5 million people have
Andererseits
left
ist
Europe from this
Bremerhaven aber
place. On the
gerade
other
als
hand,
Hafenstadt
Bremerhaven
auch
is
ein von
also
Einwanderung
the
geprägter Ort.
city
Ja,
that is
ein
very
von
much
Einwanderern gebauter Ort. Die Geschichte
influenced
dieser
by
Stadt
the migration. The history of
Einwanderungsgeschichte.
this place is the
Man kann also
history of
sagen, weggehen und
immigration.
ankommen
You
liegen
can
hier
say
näher
that
beisammen
going
als
away
anderswo.
and staying is
Bremerhaven
more
ist ein
important than in
Kreuzungspunkt für
other
viele
places. This is
Lebensgeschichten
the
mit ihren je
place where
eigenen Motiven,
many
den Geburts- oder
people have
Kindheitsort zu verlassen.
left the place
Motive,
and
bei
they
denen
have
sich
a lot of
Zwang,
remembrance
Unfreiwilligkeit,
from the childhood
Unfreiwilligkeit
about
oft nur
that
sehr
very
schwer
often, and they
auseinanderhalten
had
lassen.
to go away
Viele dieser
against their
Lebensgeschichten
will.
erzählen wir
There
hier
are a
im
lot
Deutschen
of
Auswanderhaus seit der Eröffnung des Museums
histories,
im Jahr 2005.
individual histories, and we're
Nach
trying
zwei
to
umfangreichen
talk
Erweiterungen
about
ist
them
das Museum
since
heute
the
ein Ort,
opening
an dem
of
die
this
Geschichte der
museum today. The
Migration
museum
aus,
is the
über
place
und nach
where
Deutschland
we
zugleich
are talking
nacherlebt und
about the
verstanden werden
history
kann.
of
Und
this
nicht
place,
zuletzt
and
auch reflektiert
this
und
has to be
diskutiert.
also
Deswegen freuen wir
shown
uns umso
here and
mehr, wenn das Museum
understood.
auch
That
als
is
Ort
why we
dienen
are
kann,
very happy that this
diejenigen
museum
diskutieren zu
can
lassen,
be the
ohne deren
place to
wissenschaftliche
discuss
Arbeit
about
es
those
nicht, ja,
without
kein Museum möglich
whom
wäre. Deswegen freue
whose
ich mich ebenso
scientific
ungemein,
influential
Sie hier begrüßen
influence
zu
this
dürfen.
place
In
would
diesem
not
Sinne
be
wünsche ich
possible
uns
to
allen
open. That
viele
is why I'd like to
Erkenntnisse
welcome
und für
you.
eine
That is why
Debatte, wie
I
es sich
wish you
dazu
all the
gehört,
best and
viel
wish you a very
Streitlust.
nice
Dankeschön.
debate and a lot of energy to
Als
dispute.
nächstes möchte ich Herrn Professor Jan
As
Riddel
next,
begrüßen,
I'd
der
like to
leider
ask
wegen des
Mr. Jan
Wetters
Riddle, who
in
is
München
the
gelandet ist
leader
und
who's
wird sich mit uns online in Verbindung
landed in
setzen.
Munich and who's going to
arbeitet an der
connect to us
Pädagogischen
online,
Universität
and
in
who
Krakau,
works
ist
on the
polnischer
Pedagogical
Koordinator
University
des
in
Europäischen
Krakow, and he's
Netzwerkes
the Polish
Erinnerung und
coordinator of the
Solidarität und
European
Mitglied des
network of the
Lenkungsausschusses des
Remembrance
Netzwerkes.
and Solidarity, and he's also responsible for the usage of the network. Thank you very much.
Man kann mich
I
hören.
hope that you can hear me.
Also, sehr geehrter Herr Dr. Bonker,
dear
sehr
Dr.
geehrter
Bonker, dear
Herr Dr. Olszewski,
Dr. Olszewski,
sehr geehrte Damen und
and
Herren,
dear
ich freue
ladies and
mich sehr,
gentlemen, I am very
dass trotz
happy
der
that
durch Wetter
despite
verursachten
the
Abenteuer ich
adventures caused
Sie
by the
zur
weather,
Debatte
I
Europe on
can
the Move
participate to
im
the
Namen des
debate Europe on the Move in the
Europäischen
name of the European
Netzwerks Erinnerung und
network
Solidarität
of
begrüßen
Remembrance and Solidarity.
kann. Das Netzwerk, unser
This
Netzwerk, das Netzwerk
our network,
Erinnerung und
the
Solidarität ist
Remembrance
eine
and Solidarity
internationale
is an
Institution,
international institution,
deren Mitglieder
and the members of these
Staaten sind. Und
institutions
zwar
are the states.
Vollmitglieder sind Deutschland,
And
Polen,
German,
Rumänien, die
Poland,
Slowakei und
Romania,
Ungarn.
Slovakia, and Hungary
Außerdem
are the members, except for that,
beteiligen sich an der
other
Tätigkeit des Netzwerks auch
nations are participating
Observerstaaten,
in the activities of this network. They are the so-called
Albanien,
observer states
Litauen,
like Albania,
Lettland, Österreich,
Latvia,
die Tschechische
Lithuania,
Republik
Austria,
und Georgien.
Czechia, and Georgia.
Der Sekretariat des Netzwerks
And the secretary of the
befindet sich in
network is
Warschau.
located in
Unser
Warsaw.
Sekretariat
Our
bildet ein
secretary
sehr
office
leistungsfähiges Team von
has a very capable
fast
team
30
consisting
Personen.
of about 30 people.
Die Aufgaben des Netzwerks,
The
der
tasks of the
seit
network
2010
since
volle
2010
Tätigkeit ausübt, die Aufgaben liegen in der Geschichte des 20. Jahrhunderts
history of the
und
20th century,
bestehen aus Initiierung und Förderung
it is
des
about initiating and
internationalen,
supporting the international
offenen, ehrlichen und
open,
empathischen Dialogs,
sincere
Dialogs über
and compassionate
die
dialogue
traumatischen und kontroversen Ereignisse der
regarding the
neueren
trauma-prone
Vergangenheit.
newest history.
Diese Ereignisse sind sehr
These
häufig, beziehungsweise
events
wirken sehr häufig in die
have
Gegenwart
very
ein.
often
Es geht darum,
still big impact today.
Es geht dem Netzwerk darum und
The network
sowohl
is
dem Netzwerk als auch den
both the
Staaten,
network and the
Ministerien,
states and the
die uns
ministries
ins Leben berufen haben. Es
who
geht uns darum,
have
die
created this
Umwandlung
network
der
want
historischen
to
Kontroverse in die handfeste
influence the
internationale Konflikte
historical
durch Dialog
controversies
zu
and
vermeiden.
they want
Wie Sie
to
verstehen,
alleviate or
erfüllt das Thema
work
unserer
against international
heutigen Debatte
conflicts.
alle
The topic of this
Voraussetzungen dessen,
debate
was das Netzwerk
is
als Aufgabe
to
hat.
talk about
Äh,
what are the
wie wir wissen, die Zwangsmigrationen
most important
sind schließlich sehr oft Ursachen der langfristigen internationalen Konflikte. Daher interessieren die Zwangsmigrationen unser Netzwerk vordergründig.
Our network is
Lassen Sie
trying
mich
to
zum Schluss dieses kurzen
analyze that. Let me finalize this
Schlusswortes
short introduction by
unserem
saying
Partner, dem Deutschen Auswandererhaus und dem Bundesinstitut für Kultur und
I
Geschichte
wanted
des östlichen
to
Europa
also
für
welcome you in the name of
ausgezeichnete
our house and the
bei der
European Institute
Veranstaltung
of
unserer Debatte
History of
danken.
Central and Eastern Europe, and I'd
danke
like to
ebenfalls
thank this institution for the
meinen
organization of
Kolleginnen und
debate.
Kollegen, den
Of this debate, I would
Mitarbeitern des
also like to thank
Netzwerks,
to my colleagues and the employees or the colleagues working for this network,
Frau Maria
like Gloria Machnowska,
Naimska, die
Julia Naimska,
gestern in München war,
who
aber
been
konnte
yesterday
genauso
to
wie ich
Munich,
nicht,
but as I couldn't,
nicht
they
nach
also couldn't
Bremerhaven kommen.
get to
Das war unmöglich.
Bremerhaven because
Und
it
Herrn
proved to
Dr.
be
Bartosz
impossible, and
Dziewanowski-Stefańczyk
Dr. Bartosz
für die
Dziewanowski-Stefańczyk
inhaltliche und
for the very
logistische Vorbereitung
substantial and
unseres
thorough
heutigen
preparation
Treffens.
of this
Ich wünsche
meeting.
uns allen
I wish all of you
in
who are,
Mitteleuropa
so to say, spread across the Central Europe
gelungene Veranstaltung,
to have a very
Debatte von heute. Dankeschön.
well
Wir
and
bedanken
very
uns.
successful debate. We also thank you very much.
Last but not least begrüße ich Herrn Dr. Burkhard
And last
Olszowski,
but not least, I would
wissenschaftlichen
like to
Mitarbeiter
welcome
des
Dr. Burkhard
Bundesinstituts für
Olszowski, who
Kultur und
is the
Geschichte des
scientific
östlichen Europa in
advisor
Oldenburg.
of the Institute for the European Institute from Oldenburg.
Ja, meine Damen und Herren, auch ich
Well,
möchte Sie
ladies and
herzlich
gentlemen, I also would
in
like to
Bremerhaven
welcome you very
willkommen
warmly in
heißen. Wir sind ja fast in der
Bremerhaven.
Nachbarschaft,
We are
nämlich vom
almost in the
Bundesinstitut für
neighborhood
Kultur und
here
Geschichte des
from
östlichen
the
Europas in
Institute of,
Oldenburg. Vielleicht ein
we
paar
are
Worte
from
sagen
the
zu dieser
Oldenburg, and I
Einrichtung. Es
wanted
handelt
to
sich
tell you a
dabei
bit
eine
about
sogenannte
this place.
Ressortforschungseinrichtung
It
im
is
Geschäftsbereich
a
des
scientific institute
Kulturstaatsministeriums,
that
also von
is
Frau Claudia Roth.
subsidized by the
Wir
Institute of
beraten
Culture,
insofern
the
dieses
Ministry of
Haus,
Culture by
unternehmen aber
Claudia
auch
Roth.
eigene
In
Forschungen
this
im Bereich von
house,
Ost-
we are running
Mitteleuropa
our
und
own
nicht
research
nur im
on
Bereich der
the
Geschichte,
Central
sondern auch
and Eastern Europe. And it's not
Kunstgeschichte,
about
Philologie
history,
und
but it's also
Ethnologie.
about cultural
Und
history,
zugleich unterrichten wir
philology,
an der Karl von
and
Ossowski
other
Universität in Oldenburg.
topics, and we are
Seit dem
cooperating with the
russischen
University in
Angriffskrieg, das sei
Oldenburg.
hinzugefügt,
Since the
widmet sich das Institut stark dem Schutz
Russian
ukrainischer Museen. Dies im Auftrag
attack on Ukraine, we
sowohl
try to protect the cultural
des
heritage of
Kulturstaatsministeriums
Ukraine
und in diesem Jahr auch des
and
Auswärtigen
the
Amts.
Ministry of
Denn es geht
Culture and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs
tatsächlich
is
Schutz
supporting
von
that
Museen,
because we
Bibliotheken
want
und
to
vielen anderen
protect
Kultureinrichtungen.
the
Denn,
cultural
das muss
institutions
ich
and
Ihnen nicht sagen,
libraries.
der
And I
Krieg
don't have to tell you
zielt
that this
auch,
war is
auf diese
also
Einrichtung.
directed
Und die
against
russische
those
Regierung
institutions
möchte
and the
die
Russian
ukrainische Kultur, die ukrainische Identität schwächen und
state
gar
wants
beseitigen.
to weaken or simply
Auch ich
completely
möchte
erase the Ukrainian culture.
kurz ein Wort des Dankes
I also
aussprechen.
like
Jannik,
to
du hast das
thank you in
eigentlich alle
short
Wesentlichen genannt, aber so ein
because you
Nachmittag
have mentioned
mit einem Hauptvortrag
all
und
the
zwei
most
Panels
important participants,
ist
but
nicht
today we'll
machbar,
have
ohne
a
dass
few
viele Leute daran beteiligt
lectures
sind,
and
viele
few main
Kollegen aus
panels,
dem
and it is very
Netzwerk.
important to have
Insbesondere
the
möchte ich
colleagues from this
Julia
network, and I
Machnowska
especially
dafür
like to
ganz
thank
herzlich danken.
Julia
Die
Machnowska
hat,
for that,
glaube ich, die
because
Hauptlast
she
geschultert. Insofern,
has
Julia, also auch
is most
meinerseits nochmal vielen
responsible for
Dank.
that, and
Nun, meine Damen und
I
Herren, ein
like
paar
to personally
Überlegungen, weil wir werden uns
thank
ja
her. Now,
in den
few
nächsten
thoughts on that,
Stunden
because during the next
auch mit
hours
Migration
we'll
und
be
mit
dealing with migration and
dem 20. Jahrhundert befassen.
with the
Und
20th
insofern doch ein paar
century.
Überlegungen.
So, a few thoughts on
Der
that.
moderne Nationalismus führte
The
insbesondere im
modern
20. Jahrhundert zu einem
nationalism of the 20th
präzedenzlosen
century has
Anstieg
led to an
von
unprecedented
Flüchtlingszahlen.
growth in the
Kriege,
migration waves.
der Erste und
The
der Zweite
wars,
Weltkrieg,
the
waren
First
dafür
and the Second World
maßgeblich
War,
auch mitverantwortlich.
were
Dass Menschen aufgrund
responsible
ihrer
for that
Nationalität
in
oder
a big part,
Ethnizität ihre
because
Heimat
people
verlassen
based
mussten.
on the ethnicity or
Die
nationality
internationale
had to
Politik
leave their
folgte im Zeitalter
countries.
der
The
Nationalstaaten
national policy
einer aus
of
heutiger
the
Sicht
national
abstoßenden
states
Logik.
have
Massenhafte
been following the
Völkerungsverschiebungen
very
wurden bis zur Mitte des 20. Jahrhunderts
inhumane logic,
als
and
zwar nicht
it
unbedingt
lasted until the
wünschenswertes,
end of
aber durchaus
20th
legitimes
century. It was
Mittel
not very
erachtet, um Nationen,
good,
wie man
but it was
glaubte, zu
legitimated by
stabilisieren
the
oder
national
internationalen
will
Frieden
to
zu stiften.
stabilize
Dabei war bereits in der
the
Zwischenkriegszeit
states,
eine
but
Entgrenzung der
in the time between the
Bevölkerungsverschiebung zu
wars,
beobachten.
we've
Während sie zunächst nur
been already
bestimmte,
observing a
besonders
lot of
umstrittene
movements
Regionen
in
betrafen,
migration, and
zumindest
this
auf dem Papier
was
freiwillig
also
sein sollten und nur etwa ein
applied for
Drittel
a
der
very
betroffenen Minderheiten
for
erfassten,
disputed
wurde
regions,
nach
and it has
dem Abkommen
mostly
von Lausanne,
influenced
und
some
darum soll es ja
minorities, and
auch
after
bei
the
der heutigen
Treaty of
Veranstaltung
Lausanne,
gehen,
and
also ab
this is what
1923
this
ganze
event is
Staaten
about.
flächendeckend ethnisch
Since
homogenisiert.
1921, whole
Nun gab es
nations
keine
were
Ausnahmen mehr.
reorganizing
Minderheiten wurden
on a national basis, and they wanted to get rid of minorities or transfer them.
Trotz des Leids der Flüchtlinge entwickelte sich Lausanne zu einem Modell für die Lösung von Minderheitenproblemen. Auf das Großbritannien und Frankreich rekurrierten und wenig später in mörderischer Form NS-Deutschland und seine Verbündeten. Ethnische Säuberungen beruhen im Gegensatz zu Genoziden auf der Vorstellung, dass die jeweilige Minderheit eine Heimstatt hat, dass es ein Zielland gibt, in dem sie transferiert werden kann. Immerhin bedeutete die Existenz externer Nationalstaaten, dass sich jemand für diese Menschen zuständig fühlte. Im Gegensatz etwa zu den vielen russischen Revolutions- oder Bürgerkriegsflüchtlingen in den frühen 20er Jahren,
in the
aber
early
auch den
20th
vielen Juden,
century.
die vor Antisemitismus
And a lot
flohen,
of
oder heute den Syrern,
Jews
Afghanen,
that have to run away from the
Irakern und vielen
migration
Migranten
now.
aus
Today
Afrika,
it's
die es nach Europa
Afghanis or
geschafft haben.
many
Es
inhabitants
gibt
of
keinerlei Grund,
Africa
die nationale
who had to get to
Solidarität
Europe.
der aufnehmenden Staaten zu idealisieren. Denn
There
deren
is no
Flüchtlingspolitik hatte eine weite
The
Spannbreite.
migration policy
Sie
had
reichte
another
historisch jetzt
dimension.
betrachtet
It has
von einer raschen
caused
rechtlichen Gleichstellung und sozialstaatlichen
a
Privilegierung
lot
im Fall der
of
deutschen Vertriebenen nach
differences in
1945
privileges between
bis
different
zur
members
absichtlichen
of the
Ausgrenzung
nation,
zum Beispiel
and
der
it has led
Palästinenser in den
to
meisten Nachbarstaaten
the
Israels mit Ausnahme Jordaniens. Diese
bad
Unterschiede
treatment of
zeigen,
Palestinians
dass
and
der
other
Handlungsspielraum der
smaller
Flüchtlinge
nations. This
grundsätzlich
means that
beschränkt ist,
this
worauf es in diesen Fällen maßgeblich
help for those
ankam,
nations has been very
waren die
limited.
Einstellung, die
And
Aufnahme
it
Gesellschaften
also means
und
that
ihrer
the
politischen Eliten.
migration, the nations receiving the migrants had to change
Im
their
Zuge
way
des
of
europäischen
treating them.
Einigungsprozesses, also das heißt
Through
nach
the
19,
unification
insbesondere nach
program,
1989 und
especially
den friedlichen Revolutionen,
starting
gab es
from
die
the
Hoffnung,
89,
dass es in
hope
Europa zu keinem
appeared
Krieg
that there won't
und
be any
demzufolge auch
war
zu
in
keiner
Europe,
Massenflucht mehr kommen würde.
and that there
Die
will not be
Krisensymptome
any
gab es
mass
aber bereits mit
migration
dem
movements, but the
Jugoslawienkrieg
crisis has
oder
started
Kriegen
from the
und
Yugoslavian
der
war or
russischen
wars
Krim-Annexion
and the
2014.
Russian Crimea
Doch spätestens
annexation
seit
in
dem 24.
2015.
Februar letzten
But
Jahres,
then
dem russischen Angriffskrieg
since
gegen die Ukraine,
the
mussten wir registrieren,
February
dass dies
2021,
eine
we had
Illusion
to
war.
see that this was an illusion.
Und dieser Krieg hat sagen auch eine
This
Vorgeschichte,
war
die wiederum auch 100
has
Jahre
also
zurückreicht, denn auch in den Jahren 1920 bis
a very
22
long
versuchte die
history.
Ukraine unabhängig
In
zu
the
werden und wurde bekämpft
we
von
were
der
trying to
Bolschewiki und der
make
Roten
the
Armee.
Ukrainian
Die
independent
extreme
and
Gewalt,
freedom from the
die nunmehr in
Bolshevism.
Europa
The
zurück ist, gepaart
extreme
mit Tausenden von Toten, Zerstörung und
violence
Leid und
that
Millionen von
was
Flüchtlingen,
introduced in Europe that has
ist zugleich eine
resulted in the
Herausforderung für uns, für
migration
unsere
of millions is
freiheitlich-demokratische
also
Lebensweise.
a threat
Wir
to
sind
our
in gewisser Weise auch
democratic way of
angegriffen.
life
Ob wir
that has been
solidarisch
under
und
attack.
wehrhaft oder gar
We have to
kriegstüchtig
see
genug
whether
sind,
we're going to
angesichts
be
eines multiplen
tough enough
Abnutzungskrieges, in dem
to
unsere Aufmerksamkeit
face the
für das
many
Geschehen, die mir
attrition
scheint,
wars
allmählich
that
verblasst,
are
ja sich abnutzt
happening
angesichts
around
vieler
us,
paralleler Krisen
because we
und eines
also can see a
neuerlichen
lot of
Krieges in
parallel
Nahost,
crises
der wiederum
in the
viel mit
West and Ost.
kolonialer Staatenbildung vor 100 Jahren in Syrien
And
und
this
Palästina
is
zu
also
tun hat.
related to many
Lassen Sie mich zum Abschluss
colonial
sagen,
wars.
wir
Let me
sehen
tell
die
you in the end
Migranten
that
als Waffe
we can
in
see the
Belarus
migrants as
und
a weapon
Russland,
in Belarus and
sowohl an
Russia,
Polens Ostgrenze als auch an der
and
finnischen-russischen
also
Grenze
on the eastern
instrumentalisiert werden.
border of Poland, as
Und
well on
zugleich
the
spüren wir
eastern
hierzulande
border
in
of
Europa,
Finland.
wie sehr
And
unsere
in
Gesellschaften
here
die
we can
Gleichzeitigkeit
see, we can
von
feel
den eben
how
erwähnten
our
zwei Kriegen
societies
und
are
der Flüchtlings- oder
influenced by those two
Klimakrise
wars,
fordert.
as well as by the
Ja, wie mir
migration
scheint,
crisis.
droht zu überfordern.
And we seem to be overstretched through
Eine
those
Antwort könnte
crises.
sein,
The answer to that could
Gemeinsinn,
be
demokratische Resilienz,
a
eine
democratic
systematische,
resilience, a
langfristige
systematic
Integration von
long-term
Zuwanderern und
integration
nicht
of
zuletzt
migrants,
ein wohlverstandener,
and
abgestufter
also a
Wohlstandsverzicht
well understood
der reichen
and
Industrienation,
leveled down
diesen
giving up
mehrfachen
on the welfare
Herausforderungen zu begegnen.
to
Ich danke für Ihre
be
Aufmerksamkeit
able
und
to
wünsche
face
uns
those
jetzt in den
challenges. Thank you for
kommenden
your
Panels fruchtbare und spannende
attention,
Diskussionen.
and I wish you a very fruitful and very interesting discussions during those panels. Ladies and gentlemen, because most of the debate will be run in English, I'd like to change into English. This all will be interpreted into English.
Europe 1918-1923, which was created by the European Network Remembrance and Solidarity and has been shown in over 20 European cities since its first presentation in 2018. Here you can see the 2019 presentation in Berlin. It tells the story of how the new order was created in East Central Europe in the aftermath of the First World War. The main goal of the project is to illustrate the scale of political changes and show its impact on current politics, as well as to present different national memories. It is important because the experience of East Central Europe was very different from the Western one. So we spoke about wars, economic and social consequences of the Great War, about changes in arts and everyday life, about various cultures of memory in the 20s and 30s, about propaganda of the newly established authorities, as well as about reasons why this new Versailles system broke down. Should you be interested in it, you can see the catalog of the exhibition either on our webpage, or you can find it also here, the English version. Part of the exhibition was devoted to peace treaties, and here we come to the debate. The year 2023 marks the centenary of the Treaty of Lausanne, which ended the Greco-Turkish War, and by amending the Treaty of Sèvres, it was the ultimate peace treaty ending the First World War. In his recent book, J. Winter, a leading world expert on the First World War, wrote that while Lausanne formally ended the suffering of the war between Greece and Turkey, and thus it saved thousands of lives, it also carries a negative legacy. It erased the Armenian state created by the treaty in Sèvres. It undermined the League of Nations, especially its minority rights policy, and it prepared the ground for the compulsory population exchange. In other words, massive expulsions were legalized back in 1923. Therefore, as Bruce Clark stated, we are all Lausanne's children. And indeed, since the world has seen numerous expulsions since then, when we were planning the debate, there was the refugee crisis going on. When we were organizing it, the dramatic full-scale war in Ukraine broke out, and we are holding it during the war in Gaza, Palestine. Therefore, taking into account the content of the exhibition and the fact that migrations are one of the most important processes in the history of the 20th century, we decided to focus on this issue, on migration. We are happy that the debate is located here at the German Immigration Center in Bremerhaven, itself both a historical and memory site of European migration. Let me introduce the keynote speaker now. Professor Christoph Ras studied modern history, economic and social history, as well as information science, and graduated from Saarbrücken University. He completed his doctorate as well as habilitation at the Faculty of Economics at Aachen University before joining the historical department at the Institute for Migration Research and Intercultural Studies at the University of Osnabrück, where he is full professor of modern history and historical migration studies since 2015. He specializes in social history, migration studies, organized violence, and social history of institutions. Professor Ras, the floor is yours.
Meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren, and that's it for the German part of the lecture. Thank you for the kind invitation to help start this conference and set the tone for today's debate. I'm a historian by training and trade, and could easily spend the 40 or so minutes, and I will talk for 45 minutes sharp, 45 minutes or so allotted to me by presenting a narrative of past migration movements to, from, and within Europe, but I will not, at least not from the beginning. Migration studies, including the historical branch, have been rapidly changing in recent years, as more and more of us embrace the reflexive turn, a movement that critically asks how the meaning of migration is constructed by policymaking in media discourses, through norms and institutions and their practices, and not least by academic migration research. And I think the ENRS network, with its task to renegotiate how we translate the past into history and memory, and the reflexive turn in migration studies are actually a perfect match for today. Taking that notion seriously requires questioning the terms, concepts, definitions, and discursive practices that constitute the meaning of migration, deconstructing currently dominant narratives and their power structures, questioning the path dependencies of their reproduction, and renegotiating how we became who we are today as migration societies. Today's debate pivots from the Treaty of Lausanne and its centenary. This international treaty can be read, we've just heard it, as creating modern Turkey, ending the Great War, or establishing one of the more infamous tools of interwar international migration policies, the population exchange. It took up a practice that had emerged shortly before the First World War, multiplied it by the idea of an unmixing of people, and turned state-regulated but forced resettlement into an institution in the toolbox of the guiding principles of a new post-war world order, a world order meant to create everlasting peace. The realities of diverse populations were supposed to be solved by creating seemingly perfect nation states, sovereign territories with ethnically homogeneous populations. Smart move. Today, I will not elaborate on the various close readings of the Treaty of Lausanne presented by nation-states and their historians, politicians, the media, or scholars of different academic disciplines across time and space. However, the historical anchor point of this event today sets the stage perfectly for my talk, a reflection of the framing constructs that largely determine how we create migration histories and forge migration policies and migration regimes, or in other words, how and who we are as migration societies. Homo sapiens, as we all seem to know, is a species in motion. From the settlement of the inhabitable surface of planet Earth and the transition from nomadic lives of hunter-gatherers to more static civilizations in prehistoric times, to the gravitation of populations into proto-urban centers, from migrations of ethnic groups uprooted by disaster, violence, or famine, to expansionist projects of conquest, from the search for a more peaceful or prosperous life to violence-induced displacement. This observation is true, even though most people by now lead a sedentary life. And even among those on the move, only a fraction is perceived and thus counted as migrants in different categories of migration. In 2021, about 3.6% of humans were counted within current definitions of migration, but 96.4% were not. We could, however, argue that the lives of most people across the globe are touched directly or indirectly by various forms of mobility and their repercussions. In fact, that we capture certain movements by concepts like migration, but not other phenomena involving human mobility, indicates that migration actually has a dichotomous character as a social process and as a social construct. That is to say, mobility and migration characterize our global civilization on two levels: through actual social processes and through the ways these processes are constructed and perceived and given meaning to. The production of what migration means determines, at least in part, the meaning of being sedentary or mobile, of belonging or being alien, of being included or being excluded, of having rights or not, and of the relevance of one's identity. In that respect, migration truly is a constitutive part of the human condition, as Klaus-Jürgen Bade famously wrote in 2007. If we adopt this constructivist perspective, reflection is required on, for example, how different forms of spatial mobility are or were perceived and described by contemporaries, and also by retrospective analysis and narrationist projects, ex post constructs about migration that are projected onto the past when we translate it into the history we write today. In earlier days, movements across cultural boundaries of collectives ruled by different lords or between territorialized spaces may have been regarded as a disruptive phenomena. But contemporaries would not have grasped them with concepts resembling our current notions of migration. Today, scholars, politicians, bureaucrats, or the public name such phenomena migration, others not, and such classifications are subject to constant change. So are the ways that migration histories become part of our memory and identity, another process that undergoes continuous renegotiation as historiographic path dependencies evolve and are being challenged by disruptive narrative projects and interventions, like, for instance, post-colonial perspectives. Neither the movement of Roman settlers or soldiers across the empire, nor the movement of Europeans across the globe in the mercantile era would have occurred to be migrations as we define them today to any contemporary observer or actor. What was labeled a population exchange in 1923 figured as resettlement a bit later, and is today probably studied as a case of forced migration or violence-induced mobility. What is called migration and what not determines how human movements become visible. For instance, through practices making certain forms of migration as something unusual, threatening, permanent or temporary, legal or irregular, requiring regulation and control, or deserving laissez-faire, while making other forms of migration simply disappear. We gathered here will, of course, not agree on this issue, and we do not have to. Those of us who take a realist or empiricist perspective assume that migration simply does exist in absolute terms and can be directly observed. Fair enough. Constructivists in our midst will argue that any observation of migration depends on the categories constructed and their application by specific actors from their specific positions, whether they are dealing with migration in the past, present, or in the future. Think ahead to our panel discussion in a minute. We will discuss forced migration as a collective phenomenon framed by violence and state practices, and economic migration as a voluntary and rather individual movement. Do refugees never individually plan their escape based on their agency? And is voluntary migration, as in labor migration, not politically controlled and regulated by recruitment schemes or immigration laws, leveraging great selectivity regarding whom to admit as an immigrant? And does that not seriously limit the agency of people we call labor migrants and may turn into irregular migrants or trafficked people exploited for work? Of course, only such constructs, categories, and world models allow us to get a hold of such phenomena in the first place. How would we otherwise talk about them? However, every decision involved in this construction process merits critical reflection. Why does migration research at times mimic political definitions of migration by treating refugee migration and economic migration as naturally distinct, rather than employing more universal approaches like the concept of betterment migration, while deconstructing political definitions of migration we often too easily adopt? Allow me to elaborate from the constructivist position we at EMIS take also in the recently granted Sonderforschungspreis 1604, titled The Production of Migration, which aims to create a theory of the social production of the meaning of migration and its impact. From where we stand, international migration, that was mentioned several times before today, for example, is a rather recent phenomenon. It could be argued that migration, which in our modern understanding almost always requires crossing an international border to be deemed relevant, needed the modern state system to evolve, to be invented in the 17th century. Ideas of sovereignty, territory, a population, or people, and citizenship had to be conceived, normalized, established, and institutionalized before international migration could even happen. Within that framework, migration emerged as mobility across political but not cultural boundaries necessarily for a prolonged period. Internal migration then refers to movements within such entities. International migration describes crossing borders between states. That is a definition few of us would doubt. The concept of international migration thus requires accepting several socially constructed institutions that have become political realities, and requires us to either treat this as a given or as something to be scrutinized and deconstructed when we study the configuration of human mobility between such entities as international migration. I return to my earlier observation. On one level, movement, mobility, and migration are key elements of human responses to changing conditions, and thus can be seen as forceful phenomena brought about by change and causing change. On another level, the meaning of such mobility as migration is produced by practices ranging from political, administrative, or academic modes of observation, classification, and narration to regulatory actions of the many institutions connected to it directly and indirectly. Both these levels, speaking with Anthony Giddens, interact in a continuous process of structuration. In the light of the reflexive turn, migration research can thus not limit itself to quantification, statistics, or normative or otherwise positivist explanations of the phenomenon or of migration policies. It must also be aware of the narratives, cultural practices, power structures, and path dependencies that determine how the phenomenon is presented and perceived, and how these constructs stem from but also impact the socio-historical process. And we must reflect on the contributions of academics who are not just observers but part of this process. Thus, we are tasked to discuss international migration not only concerning its vectors and dimensions and actors and institutional frameworks as such, but to constantly ask ourselves in what specific ways different meanings of migration determine how human movements are made relevant or irrelevant. While focusing, for example, on international migration as an interstate movement of humans, we need to be aware of what this choice puts out of the picture. Setting the state center marginalizes concepts that try to study mobility in other ways, like approaches proposing to classify mobility solely by the distinction, for example, between long-distance or global migration rather than international migration. Concepts that try to define the field in less biased ways along paradigms, for example, like transculturalism, transregionalism, or translocalism. Putting the state and its borders at the center also moves internal migration into the background, even though it comprises the larger share of human mobility. That becomes particularly apparent in the distinction between refugees as international migrants and, by now, internally displaced persons as victims of forced migration moving within territorial borders. The category of internally displaced persons, however, is the fastest growing group of forced migrants or victims of violence-induced mobility globally. While the political context of such labeling practices is as obvious as the interconnectedness between the national and the international level, or the often dire consequences for those who do not become objects of the international refugee regime by respective classifications, the separation of forced migration into these two spheres seem to be holding not just in the political sphere but in the academic sphere as well. It could thus be argued that the strict separation of internal and international migration, or between voluntary, economic, and involuntary forced migration in migration scholarship, is a serious epistemological flaw generated by adopting a nation-state perspective that largely prevents a connected analysis of the links between different forms of mobility. In other words, we should study political definitions of migration but not adopt them as analytic categories. The practice of analyzing migration from a nation-state stance has drawn up, of course, much criticism, for instance, as methodological nationalism, as well as warnings of a territorial trap it sets for researchers as early as the 1990s that triggered a whole body of scholarship devoted to transnational approaches to all aspects of migration, from migrants' decision-making to state efforts to regulate international migration. It has by now become clear that international migration, defined as the movement of humans between internationally recognized states or across their borders, can be classified by many different typologies that have evolved and changed over time. Classical accounts, for example, written in the early years of the 20th century, not far apart in time from the Treaty of Lausanne, distinguished mainly between violent dispossession by invasion or conquest from immigration, an idea of migration that we now would rather call settlement migration or settler colonialism today. Sometime later, dichotomies between voluntary and forced movement, regular and irregular, permanent and temporary, and economic or refugee migration moved to the foreground and became dominant. As Russell King argued, such prevalent constructions of migration and their application must be always deconstructed by migration research rather than reproduced or affirmed. In an attempt to do so, different migrant-orientated classifications have emerged, which distinguish between free migrants moving along the lines of state-determined migration channels, self-willed labor migrants seeking betterment from economic strain, bound labor migrants migrating under contract to work abroad for a limited time, forced labor migrants, involuntary migrants displaced by intolerance and inequalities, refugees from war and violence, and migrants displaced by ecological disasters, to give just a few examples. By the same token, historical migration research has also developed its own typologies of migration that rely, for instance, on motivation, distance, directionality, temporality, space, and economic dimensions. Each of these classifications has epistemological consequences. They depart from a certain meaning of migration and arrive at its reproduction sometimes or at its disruption in other instances. It simply does make a difference whether a research-driven, critically reflected topology is employed or if topologies are derived from a state perspective stressing its normative frameworks. In the first case, classifications typically aim at distinguishing between betterment migration in various forms, violence-induced migration in terms of flight or displacement, migration as an adaptation strategy or as a contingency plan reacting to catastrophes or climate change, forced migration related to labor or exploitation, occurring in different frameworks ranging from immigration and recruitment programs to smuggling and trafficking of humans. In the second case, normatively framed forms of regular or irregular migration, temporary or circular labor migration, refugee or asylum migration, and exclusion by forced removal, as in deportation, would figure prominently. The phenomena addressed in both cases from both perspectives could actually be the same, but the perspective towards them changes through our positionality that determines how human mobility is constructed. The categories given in the first case would be leveraged as analytical concepts, and the categories given in the second case would be analyzed as practices deployed by actors within, and thus process-generated concepts according to Rogers Brubaker. By the same token, any statistical appraisal of the dimension of international migration heavily depends on how migration is defined and what data is used to measure it. Statistics create migrants along their categories and create world models through their datification. Those quantitative world models are then used by states and scholars to regulate or study migration, which tends to contribute to the path dependencies of the construction of migration embedded within them, within the data. Let us stick with those numbers for a minute. According to statistics provided by the United Nations, the number of international migrants living outside their country of birth has risen from about 84 million in 1970 to 258 million in 2017, or from 2.3% of the world's population to 3.4%. Migrants still represent only a small share of the planet's population. But while the overall growth rate of the human population has been diminishing since its peak in the early 1960s, the number and the percentage of migrants among the world's population are steadily on the rise. Depending on how we approach these figures, migration becomes more or less relevant. However, we might agree that despite strong regional discrepancies in population growth, international migration has become an increasingly important factor for global population shifts internationally and within countries or regions. At the same time, the impact of migration is not at all equally distributed. More affluent countries with negative or low population growth tend to benefit from international migration, which contributes decisively to the rise of their populations. Migration can thus be depicted as a threat, the great exchange, as racist right-wing activists would put it, or a demographic survival strategy for Western countries. In fact, about 67% of all international migrants live in just about 20 countries, while the origin and the destination of international migration are geographically shifting towards Asia. So, Europe deems itself a geographical migration hotspot, but is actually becoming less important as a waypoint for global migration movements. Is that consistent with our narratives? By the same token, refugee migration is perceived as a driver of several situations throughout the 20th century, labeled a migration crisis. At the same time, it was estimated in 2016, for example, that refugees and asylum seekers make up slightly less than 10% of all international migrants. Likewise, migration, especially when perceived as a threat, is often depicted as male, while roughly 50% of all international migrants are female. That being said, and now being aware of the dichotomous character of migration, I am prepared to offer a brief sketch of the meta-trends in international migration across the past centuries. During the early modern period, or the mercantile period as it is sometimes called, between the 16th and the 18th centuries, interstate mobility, at this time a Western or European concept that gained global contemporary relevance through European expansion and was given meaning by European narratives and historiography, as well as academic concepts like the mobility transition in migration research, gained shape along 4 lines. Firstly, economic developments fostered an increase in temporary as well as permanent migration between European states. Secondly, religious intolerance set into motion several refugee movements within Europe and across the Atlantic during the 17th and 18th centuries. Thirdly, Europeans began to move towards overseas territories which came under colonial rule, thereby destroying or transforming migration systems and civilizations which had existed in the extra-European world before this expansion set in. Finally, forced migration, induced by Europeans, began on a global and unprecedented scale with the deportation of bonded laborers into and between colonial spheres and of millions of Africans as enslaved people, mainly across the Atlantic into the Americas. These migrations have left a legacy that lies at the core of understanding racism as well as racialized migration policies. This fact must be considered in analyzing any subsequent migrations and contemporary discussions on diversity and migration. Global mass migration continued to evolve during the 19th century with increased international mobility of betterment migrants and refugees within Europe. Slavery was slowly abolished, while the mobility of bonded labor, think of the coolie system, within colonial empires gained even further importance. Up to 50 to 70 million Europeans embarked on transoceanic migrations between 1800 and 1925, mainly to the Americas or oceanic destinations, one of the main themes of this museum. Many migrants were driven by economic motives, escaping poverty and suppression. While most of this migration was still rather low-skilled, people now began to travel in small groups of families or even individuals, and women already made part a considerable proportion of migration streams, albeit they were not counted at the time by immigration statistics and as a consequence overlooked by migration research as long as the uncritical reading of numbers shaped narratives. During this period, frameworks for the regulation of migration and naturalization, as well as for the treatment of refugees, began to evolve in Europe and North America. Nevertheless, for most of the 19th century, the international movement of Europeans remained largely unrestricted by migration policies. At the same time, the deportation of unwanted immigrants, as well as the surveillance of foreigners, became institutionalized in a growing number of those countries. Ethnicity, notions of race, and racialized hierarchies, of course, interfered strongly with how societies negotiated changes induced by migration. In the United States, for example, nativism began to set Americans of old stock apart from newcomers immigrating from Germany, Ireland, Italy, or later Eastern Europe, as early as the 1840s. Later, exclusionist migration policies rooted in sheer racism targeted migrants from Asia, in the United States as well as in other European settler societies like Canada or Australia. Such policy changes were forebearers of a general turn towards restrictive migration policies between the beginning of the 20th century and the 1920s. However, they were also based on changing social constructions of migration and migrants in receiving societies, while establishing new path dependencies of the production of what migration meant and how migrants were seen and thus treated. There has been a long debate for the reasons for this turn towards regulation amongst migration scholars, listing general as well as country-specific reasons to implement borders and border control systems to identify and distinguish citizens and migrants, as well as sets of rules and institutions to regulate migration, residence, and belonging. However, as the late Adam McCune has convincingly argued, these developments should be interpreted as a move to differently regulate international mobility and integration rather than a drive towards insulating nation-states from migration. Stricter migration policies did not stop migration, they never do, but rather just changed the phenomenon. Migration for settlement did not lose all its traction during the 20th century, especially as an unintended consequence of temporary labor recruitment schemes. However, major trends in international migration since the First World War can be summed up along four major paths that indicate several secular shifts. Number one, built on precursors since the late 19th century, regulated temporary labor migration began its global ascent in the 1920s, when European countries started building recruitment schemes increasingly based on bilateral agreements and international standards developed, for instance, by the International Labour Organization. At the same time, the United States departed from rather free immigration with the 1924 Quota Act. And that transition led to the rise of labor migration from Mexico, constructed in the United States to be strictly temporary and remain largely unregulated, except for the Prosero program of the Second World War and its post-war sequel. In general terms, migration was not conceptualized as immigration for settlement anymore, but largely as a temporary state to provide deportable labor as long as needed. After the Second World War, during the European reconstruction and decolonization as well, migration streams from newly independent countries of the global south towards Europe and regulated recruitment of temporary labor migrants in what would be called guest worker programs helped fill the labor market demands of industrialized countries in northwestern Europe. Germany became, by numbers and outcome, a de facto country of immigration, albeit in strict denial back then. Formally regulated by governments, but in practice rather marked by a degree of negligence, recruitment schemes led to significant immigration into Western Europe through settlement and family reunification, and an accelerating increase in diversity as children of the second generation were born into European societies. Hence, regulated temporary labor recruitment was largely seen as a failure during the 1970s and 1980s, and a renewed effort to quench migration dynamics set in. But since the late 1990s, temporary labor recruitment has experienced a worldwide renaissance with endless attempts by regulators to ensure at last its temporary or circular character. At the same time, an increasingly critical debate about migrants' rights and the consequences of temporary migration schemes for migrants, their families, and the affected societies as a whole unfolded. Number two, refugee movements have always been a part of international migration, but gained unprecedented dimensions throughout the 20th century, making them top subjects in national and international politics. Today, refugee migration, as you all know, can be rated as the form of international movement or migration met by the most advanced set of internationally accepted standards, norms, and regulations. Forced migration, displacement, and the fate of refugees gained international attention. First in the aftermath of the Balkan Wars, shortly before the outbreak of the First World War, and especially when the international community organized the freshly founded League of Nations after the war and began care operations for survivors of the Armenian genocide, as well as Russian refugees during the revolution and the ensuing civil war. Though important institutions were created, like the Nansen passport for stateless migrants, also a new phenomenon, and various resolutions passed trying to define the status as well as the rights of refugees, and regulatory efforts were made, like the population exchange, the international system largely failed to properly react in the face of the then setting in massive refugee movements from Nazi Germany. Neither the conference held at Evian in the summer of 1938, nor the conference convening in Bermuda in 1943 would come up with a concerted effort to save and care for the fleeing Jews of Europe. During the Second World War, it is estimated that between 30 and 60 million people were displaced and forced to flee in Europe alone, as well as countless others worldwide. The anticipation of a post-war refugee crisis and the factual presence of millions of survivors of the Shoah, the German forced labor system, and prisoner of war, as well as concentration camps, but also in other theaters of war, of specialized organizations as subdivisions of the United Nations, like the UNRWA, the IRO, or later the UNHCR, as well as the formation of international laws defining the status of refugees and displaced persons, like the Geneva Convention of 1951. Integral parts of the international regulatory regime or refugee protection included a catalog of criteria that made refugees eligible for a legal refugee status supported by internationally accepted norms and conventions, and a set of standard protocols for refugee protection and long-term solution of displacement, like, for instance, repatriation and resettlement. While resettlement, or later the administration of asylum, never really worked without complex selections and hidden or open numerical limits, keeping refugees in an in-between status by granting temporary protection rather than permanent admission, or keeping refugees in camps close to their homes with repatriation in view, became a major driver of national as well as international refugee policies between the end of the Cold War and the securitization of migration in the early 21st century. After the end of the Cold War, rising numbers of refugees who reached countries that were able and willing to grant asylum during the 1990s found that while they qualified for refugee status by international standards, they only had the right to apply for asylum, while getting asylum remained at the disposal of states. States that, like Germany, began to dismantle the liberal asylum regimes they had adopted after the Second World War, and we're experiencing the next stage of that drama in today's world. As streams of refugees swelled and became more diverse with a growing south-north trajectory, more and more states turned to restrictive migration policies and practices towards asylum seekers, with increased border controls and elevated bars to pass the application process. In 2018, with levels of global displacement reaching or even exceeding those of the Second World War, the race between the will to rescue and protect refugees enshrined in the global refugee regime and a growing reluctance of states to increase immigration options for refugees tends to erode chances for permanent settlement and resettlement of refugees in affluent and peaceful countries. Once again, keeping refugees as close to their former homes with repatriation in mind seems to prevail. Number 3, some scholars argue that with tightening border controls, more selective practices of granting residence, and deportation of irregular or unwanted migrants in mind, that the denial of mobility options has become an increasingly important aspect of migration policies. When the latest phase of globalization set in during the 1970s based on a neoliberal agenda, leading industrialized countries and flanking international institutions advocated and drove forward deregulation and open market worldwide. The ensuing mobility of capital and goods led to a massive manufacturing relocation towards cheap labor. That logic required to prevent labor movements away from the new workbenches of the world, while, as the progress in development and a more even distribution of wealth initially hoped for materialized only in part, increased the numbers of potential betterment migrants that became willing to flee poverty and their lack of opportunity. The prevention of unwanted migration and especially immigration, the renewed importance of temporary labor migration, for instance, in the General Agreement on Trade and Services, GATS, and an unbroken drive towards to produce irregular migrants as exploitable labor, as well as to implement new forms of bonded labor as part of temporary labor migration schemes. These things can therefore be identified as important currents in international migration at the turn of the 21st century. These trends towards highly regulated and increasingly exploitable and as well as deportable migrants have also triggered renewed efforts to institutionalize norms for the protection of migrants on the international level as well as on the national level, with a large degree UN organizations as function as arbiters between national interests and migrants' rights in that arena, often with little effect. Number 4, the last one. The notion of unevenly distributed opportunities for international migration due to economic and political restructuring points to one further characteristic of migration today: creating supranational zones of privileged mobility and migration. This required the development of multi-level migration governance between supranational organizations and individual states, think Schengen space. This in turn tends to produce privileged classes of citizens who can move within and, under certain conditions, also between such spaces. This, then, is seen by some scholars as a solution to perceived issues of security linked to the regulation of migration. Others fear further growth of discrimination against all those who do not live or do not get access to these fenced-in blocks of privileged mobility. At the same time, delegating migration politics and policies from the nation-state to supranational entities has proven to be a most controversial and complex process, as can be witnessed in any current debate on migration in the European Union. As attempts to forge a common approach to immigration, labor migration, as well as refugee and asylum policies in the European Union demonstrate time and again, nation-states have a much harder time giving up this aspect of their perceived sovereignty than liberalizing the movement of capital and goods. Even though the movement of people should naturally be included in a liberal agenda, and even conservative scholars tend to point out the rather positive long-term effects of migration. This brief historical sketch has shown that regulating different forms of international migration is an important as well as a controversial field. It has also become evident that states are not lone actors determining migration politics or actual migration movements, but that many actors and framing conditions should be considered when discussing how migration is negotiated rather than regulated. Migrants themselves in that equation must be considered actors with an agenda and with agency of their own, who cannot simply be regulated in their aspirations to move. A person's will to move, to become mobile, whether searching for a better life abroad or evading violence and persecution at home, is the beginning of migration. A multi-layered framework of conditions and options, however, influence this decision tree. Concerning migrant choices, research has convincingly shown that decision-making and migration are embedded in family or social networks, depending on complex perceptions of potential costs and gains, and can even include intergenerational long-term considerations. This line of thought has recently expanded to recognize an autonomy of migration that defies categories and regulations imposed on human movement. At the same time, a decision to move is not a singular event. Rather, migration processes consist of a sequence of choices and decisions as people on the move adapt and change their expectations and practices. Migration outcomes thus often differ from the initial hopes or planning or policy goals that states and their agents formulate. Migration can be interpreted as linking societies with migrants, creating transnational spaces between their places of origin and their journey's transit and final destinations. Therefore, while negotiating how societies perceive migration to, from, or through, and how politics transform it into institutions and policies is often thought to be a national issue, but it really plays out in a very complex transnational arena. That keeps rendering migration politics that try to regulate migration to change its magnitudes, compositions, or characteristics in national containers obsolete. Such policies are embedded in or result from discourses and power distributions within societies based on economic considerations or fears and aspects of ethnocentrism, as well as often troubling concepts of national belonging. All of these could be rated arbitrary yet powerful constructs we probably have to overcome. Anyway, fast forward, since my time is up. In 2018, Hein de Haas, the recent author of How Migration Really Works, and fellow researchers published a working paper on the outlooks of international migration. The team arrived as a set of 10 trends and issues, some of which I would like to offer in lieu of a conclusion, as I leave my field of research and expertise, the translation of the past into histories, for the present and the future. Heinrich Haas and his colleagues recommended taking a more global view of migration streams and their magnitudes to settle fears of being overwhelmed by migration, and also to develop a less Western or Eurocentric study and narrative of migration. They also advocate for a more complex perception of forces causing migration on the sending and the receiving sides to arrive at an analytical angle that embeds migration processes into the study of related processes and the longue durée of it to get in view the more often than not positive outcomes of migration for societies. Their findings also indicate that well-established facts like the finding that the poorest of the poor seldomly have the means to migrate and hence do not move, while receiving countries feel overrun by poverty-driven migration, have to be communicated more effectively to close the gap between public perceptions of migration and analytical findings on the causes and consequences of migration. In their view, this could turn debates on migration into debates of poverty and the unequal distribution of wealth. Such a sea change could, argues de Haas, contribute to a more holistic approach to migration politics, reflecting that non-migration policies have proven highly relevant in shaping migration as well. The research team also urges us to closely observe the outcomes of trends towards more liberal or more restrictive migration policies. Liberal migration policies, they argue, often correspond with liberal economic regimes rather than with liberal political regimes. Thus, they often create less restrictive frameworks with increased selectivity regarding skill, wealth, or social status that tend to override classical criteria like ethnicity or national identity. By the same token, as can be amply studied these days, more liberal regulations of economic migration correspond often with more restrictive policies towards unwanted migrants like refugees, which currently leads to a renewed importance of deportation regimes. Scholars of contemporary migration like Hein de Haas plea for liberal migration governance emancipating itself from many preconceptions and narrative entrenched during the 20th century. Liberalized international migration, they conclude, tends to be circular and thus solve some of the fears often attributed to migration. Restrictive policies motivate attempts to stay and settle. Migration as a phenomenon cannot be analyzed, understood, and regulated in their view as an isolated issue in politics, economics, or culture, nor from a one-sided perspective of the West or a migrant-receiving society. As you can see, it is all about the meaning of migration. Thank you for your patience.